Hello, and welcome to the Race, Wealth, and Health Podcast, a podcast that serves to educate and empower while we explore the intersections of social justice, economic empowerment, and holistic well-being within communities of color. I am your host, Dr. Joycelyn Morris, and I invite you to join me as we dive deep into the crucial topics that shape our lives, challenge the status quo, and strive for a more equitable future for all. This week, we're back to continue the conversation with David Castro of Dungeon Forward. So I kind of want to transition into part two of our conversation around the brand, right? Because when we talked, we did our intro call, we talked about Dungeon Forward, which has two mantras. There's crowns for the culture, and then there's also the tagline, from nothing to something. And so tell our listeners about that. Like, how did you come up with that tagline?
Gotcha.
What does Dungeon Forward mean to you? And what is it that you are hoping to convey to your audience and people who are purchasing the brand?
Yeah, so Dungeon Forward is me, really. Like, it is my life story in its most simple way. Like, Dungeon Forward, from the Dungeon Forward, meaning from nothing to something. That's where from nothing to something comes from. And like, my background, I don't come from much. Like, I didn't have money. My family didn't have money. I went to like 11 different schools. I can't remember the count because it was an absurd amount of schools that I went to before going to college. Luckily, when I got to middle school and high school, I was able to stick it out in those schools. But in elementary school, it was all over the place. I moved around a lot. And so really finding a place to stick roots in and grow was difficult for me, right? We didn't have Facebook to stay connected with people that you met. And so I'm constantly finding myself making new friends. And I feel like remnants of that still exist within me. But because of that, like, I always felt like I was going to be good. There was not a point in time where I ever felt bad for myself or ever felt like I didn't have enough, like I didn't have the means to make something of myself. And originally Dungeon Forward was Dungeon Forward Fashion. I dropped the fashion because it's obvious what it is, right? And I felt like it was definitely a stronger statement to make. But that's where the idea of from nothing to something came from. It's essentially like my upbringing. And the idea of the brand is to inspire people to do the same, right? Most of the messaging in our brand is progressive. The newest piece that I actually have on,
I was going to ask
it's,
you to turn
yeah,
around. Yeah.
it says out here thriving, right? And the reason it says that is because, at least for me, I feel like no matter what, like, even if you're failing on the way to a win, like, the goal is the win. Like, you have tunnel vision to the win. And in that journey, no matter the ups and downs, the ultimate intent is for you to thrive. And I feel like if you keep your eye on that, there's no way that you won't actually end up hitting that goal. I know that people will hear that and they're like, oh, that's easy to say because you've done X, right? But even right now, like, we're in a space where our sales are down right now, and we're figuring out how we pivot to align back up with our audience. But I don't feel like there's defeated at all. It's just another adventure to go on with the brand, which is exciting for me. Crowns for the culture, that really comes from the people that we want to uplift. And so culture is really driven typically by the have-not. Folks that don't have create out of necessity. And crowns for those people is really identifying them and making them feel royal, because that's who we feel is really dictating the movement of where the world goes. That's where the best artists come from, the best innovators, the best athletes. They all typically come from a space of not having. And it's because it embeds in you the fervor and the desire to get out of that position. And so that's really what Dungeon Forward is about. And we've grown into a space where the intention is to inspire, educate, and really create a space for meaningful conversation around the topics that we share through the headwear that we create. And also doing that in an innovative way. And so hence, again, that Dyson and Adidas Originals, like, kind of aspiration originally. And I feel like we just recently got our first patent, which is not really even heard of for the most part in the headwear space for the last, I don't know how many years, which for us is like unbelievable, right? Because now we have something that is undeniably ours. And that's the example that we want to create for whoever's coming behind us too. Is like, hey, look at what we did. Come do it better than us, you
Mhm.
know?
Absolutely. And so as you were mentioning, talking about Dungeon 4, Crowns of the Culture, for
Mhm,
me, what stood out thinking about the focus of this podcast is how
mhm,
your brand intersects with both race, either your personal or even the brand's intersection with race and wealth. Like what
mhm.
comes up for you when you think about that?
So race, if you look at our page, right, it is a celebration of Black people. And it's a very intentional celebratory space that really is primarily Black folks, right? The reason that I've felt so strongly, and granted, like our audience is diverse, right? Like the people that rock our crowns, the
Or
reposts that we do of people that are wearing it come from all race, creed, sexual backgrounds, everything.
Mhm.
But for us, especially at the initiation of the brand, Black faces weren't really seen as much, and Black joy wasn't seen as much. So being able to depict that in a way that for us is intentional, it gives us the power to shift a narrative and to do it with something that the culture is already interacting with, which is art and street and music, right? So that already is a crossroads for race in our brand. But also, like, one of our biggest intentions is to tell stories of the culture from cultures that may be oppressed or may not typically have a voice,
Mhm.
right? And so we had a crown that was called The Rise, which highlighted pivotal moments in Black history. We're working on a project about Geronimo, which I'm not sure if you know his story, but he was Native American and his family was taken away from him and he avenged them. And so we're working on also telling that story and highlighting that because there was a certain level of redemption in that story as well that could potentially inspire people. And so I think as far as culture is concerned, it's so rooted in what we do. It's rooted in me as well.
So to your point, you are a Black owned headwear and apparel company. You mentioned there's not necessarily or hasn't been a lot of showcasing of Black joy in these
Yeah.
spaces or even just
I
at
think
events.
now there is a shift now.
Okay.
I think at the onset of our brand, that just was not seen. Like, and even Black owned brands was like, I need to make sure that I'm shooting a bunch of white folks in my apparel so that it could seem legitimate.
So that's my thing. What was it like being a Black owned brand that
Yeah.
is promoting prosperity for Black
Yeah.
people, promoting positivity for Black people in Black spaces to be one of the few, if not only, doing that? Were there any challenges or any pushback that you got entering into the market that way? Or were you able to just very quickly tap into your audience?
You know what's interesting? So, yes, we tapped into our audience, right? Because people felt seen and heard. I think that was immediately understood when we were doing pop-ups and we would have conversations with folks. On the opposite end of that spectrum, there was points in time where we also recognized perhaps the downfalls of not having full representation of a cross-section of what exists in the US. And in that, we understood it, but it was still intentional to continue to share joy. Then there was also just general negative commentary where somebody might go on our page and say, oh man, you must not like white people. It's only Black folks on the page. It was very,
People actually said that?
yeah, we got it in our DMs and we had public comments that said that. And to that, the response was Black joy makes you feel like we don't like white people. Then the problem is probably you. And I still feel very strongly in that way. Right.
Yeah.
And I'm shifting in the idea of representation in what we share in our spaces.
Mm.
And I think it's primarily because it's starting to exist across the spectrum of brands that are out there. And so now I think as we continue to highlight stories of the culture, there are going to be players in that story that don't look like me. And that's fine. I'm excited about continuing to explore it beyond that. Now, we do have a project that's called the Diaspora Project that is focused on all spaces of melanated people, whether or not you're Black or not.
Mhm.
And that really was inspired by a moment of clarity that I gained one day. I was sitting there and there was one of those commercials that came on. It was like a Feed the Children commercial, but something else. And I was thinking to myself, I wonder how much of the world is brown, because we toss around the term minority a
Yeah.
lot. And being a minority in the US doesn't necessarily mean a minority in the world. And there was one specific stat that I discovered that made me feel so ignorant. And it was that Nigeria's population is 200 million and that Africa's population is 1.2 billion. And then I'm like, in India, brown people, it's, I don't remember, like 3 billion, right? And in the US, it's 330 million people, 13% Black folk, right? We're not a minority. Brown people are the majority. And that was a major epiphany moment for me, because it was like, dang, I've been impacted by the media that's been shared with me the entirety of my life, so much
Mhm.
so that
Mhm.
I didn't even realize what the actual makeup of the world was. And so that inspired a project called the Diaspora Project, which is highlighting cultures of Black and brown people all around the world. No matter what you are considered to be, religion, race, whatever, the intention is to educate people. And so telling that story is important to me because I want other people to have that same epiphany moment. Other people
Absolutely.
to feel
Mhm.
like they belong in a
Yeah.
world that oftentimes tells them that that's not the case.
I think you brought up a really great point about being Black or brown in US versus being Black or brown in our world, right? It's the global thought and mentality versus getting stuck in this localized mindset of the United States, which has the history that it has with Black and brown
Mhm.
people. It's definitely by design, the messages
Mm,
that we hear, the things that we are conditioned, which is why it's so important and super cool that you are trying to change that narrative, putting out the positivity, encouraging us to be thriving, to be doing well versus the messages that we typically get in mainstream media. But in
mhm.
terms of your diaspora project, as much as you can potentially share about it, is it going to be a particular product or is it something else?
Think of it as a collection that doesn't end. So our brand, we have licensed product, we have our originals, and then we have our Words to Live By collection, Shanika Quran, our beanies, our HBCU collection. Think of this as being added into that mix, where this will exist forever. In the like, and so as we release, you can anticipate there'll be another release that is highlighting another culture because the inspiration is infinite, right? We did a crown several years ago that was inspired by the Maasai tribe, and it was called Mercy Tigress. And it was with an artist named Nate D out of Miami. And the inspiration behind it was the women of that tribe, because there's several images of them, but when the men go and hunt and gather, the women stand guard. And at the time, Wakanda hadn't come out yet, like
Mhm.
the
Or
Black
woman.
Panther or Woman King. But if you look, I'm certain that there's some inspiration drawn from that tribe. And there was something that both myself and the artist felt was important to portray in a piece. Those types of stories exist a million times over
Yeah.
in other cultures. You just really have to invest yourself in them and immerse yourself in that culture. So as much as time will allow, we are going to be releasing products in that space with those intentions to showcase stories just like that.
That's awesome. That's super dope. I'm looking forward to it, and we'll probably have to chat offline because I'd love
Mhm.
to hear more about how you're looking at marketing, but marketing by way of educating, and what your thoughts are about making sure that the stories behind the products are getting out there. But I'm super excited, and
Mhm.
congratulations on that.
Oh man, it's an idea right now, but I'm grateful to be on the mission of like sharing it.
No, absolutely. And you started earlier to talk about now we think about wealth, right? So
Yeah.
about thriving. What's been your personal wealth journey?
Oh yeah. So it's really been a crazy mind shift because at least in my family and perhaps our community at large, financial education wasn't really at the core. And I think that really comes from a space of need and not the idea of abundance. So if you're working to just figure out how to pay rent the next month and to figure out how you're going to put some food on the table, you don't really have the opportunity to even invest thought power to investing and strategically aligning your money. As I got older and was in a space where I was more financially stable, I started to seek that knowledge. And even in seeking that knowledge, even now I'm still learning. By no means am I fully vested in all financial mechanisms, but along the way, I felt as though it was important to establish a mentor relationship. Didn't know who that was going to be. I went to a random event that was hosted by, I think it was a bank that was just starting at the time. But one of the people on the panel was Ryan Leslie. And I stood up and I asked a question. And during his conversation, he mentioned mentorship. So I told him when I asked the question, I was like, I'm going to hold you accountable to that because I feel like that's the reason I came here today. And I didn't really know that was the case, but I have really been desperate for a mentor, not only in the financial space, but somebody who was accomplished. And we connected shortly thereafter. I sent a text. He got back to me. And then maybe about a week or so after that, we jumped on a call. And then we were on a call once a week, every week after that for about a year and a half. And it changed my mentality around money. It changed the mechanisms I use to spend on a daily basis. It changed how I use points. It changed how I spend in my business. It changed what I'm invested in outside of my business, like personally, diversified, like where I'm in ETFs and primarily securities. And then I also have a managed account. And then I have what I manage myself. And then I have daily buys of specific stocks that I feel strongly about. And I've watched this become something that's going to really support my daughter in the future. And that's priceless. But now I think it's really about how do you spread that? Like, how do you take the time to share that with other people? Me sharing that with my family. And so I feel like that's the next step. But the fear is that you lead somebody to do something that makes them lose at the onset of their first time in the space. So they could potentially get discouraged. But what I realized is that it doesn't matter. If you know and that knowledge is there, it still makes you more dangerous. I mean, my portfolio now, I look at it, I'm like, holy shit, like how did this happen? But at the same time, I still feel like I'm being pretty safe. And I'm in a space now where I really want to take some risk.
Take some bigger risk.
Yeah. And I mean, measured risk, but I think that's probably the next thing for me. So I learned in that mentorship, some day trading practices, which I don't really engage in. I learned some long-term strategies. I learned income investing. I learned options trading and how to potentially hedge your investments with options trading. And then I also learned a strategy around selling covered calls, and which is also another option strategy. And it's a strategy that the ETF that I own really functions under, but you can also do it yourself if you wanted to. All of that has really put me in a position, I think, at least to be semi-dangerous. I'm still nowhere near a pro. I'm still learning. I would put myself in the intermediate range.
Listen, fair enough. I wanted to address your point around how do you get the information out. For me, that's the whole goal of this podcast, right? Is information sharing. So again, definitely appreciate you being here and being willing to share the information. You shared high level. One of the things that you mentioned is that through that mentorship, you changed some of your financial practices in terms of how you are paying for things. I'm sure all of it was been helpful, but tell me like the top 2 to 3 shifts that you made in terms of what you were doing versus what you got put on to do. Points was one of the things you mentioned, but what game can you put our listeners on as it relates to some things you learned?
One is rich people don't use debit cards. They use credit cards. And the primary reason is that you get nothing for using a debit card. Your bank has your money and you get nothing in return for using that debit card. In fact, oftentimes you lose by using a debit card, especially if you're using it at an ATM that is not owned by your bank. So you've allowed them to leverage your money. And then as a part of them leveraging your money, when you want your money, you're spending to access your money, which seems super convoluted. So if you don't have any benefit in it, then it really makes no sense. The other thing that I learned and I put into practice is I'm not keeping a lot of money in checking accounts. If there is money in excess, it's going into an investment. And if it needs to be liquidated from that, then you can do it. But another way to gain access to funds while your money is still within that system is you can take a loan off of your investment portfolio, which it's an interesting financial mechanism. Another thing for those that are working in the corporate space, if you have a 401k plan, which if you do and they have matching, absolutely maximize the matching. A lot of people don't do it because they feel like they won't have access to their money. But another thing that people don't realize is while you may not be able to take that money out of that 401k, oftentimes you can take a loan on that 401k and the interest is going directly back to you, which let's say you have, and usually it's like 50% or 40%. So let's say you had $30,000 in a 401k, you get ready to buy a crib and you needed some down payment money for FHA loan, 3%, you got $15,000 that you could potentially put on a crib. And that's without having to engage a bank. So you're still managing your credit. So those things have been profound adjustments for me because in my business, we spend a lot of money on credit cards. So I aligned those credit cards. Well, we spent a lot of money on ads. Initially, that ad money was coming directly out of our account. Now that ad money is coming from a credit card, that credit card has benefits where you get 4 times the money spent on ads. I'm already spending, no matter what, I was already going to be spending that. So now if I want to take a trip or something, I can subsidize it 99% of the time with points. And just thinking about that and being conscious of that has been something that's also been incredible for me as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up that point about credit because I found sometimes in our communities, it can be one of two things. It's either an extreme apprehension to the idea of credit because somebody who probably messed up their own credit or messed up somebody else's credit.
Mhm.
And so the idea of using credit cards and getting in debt, because you do have to be careful. Those APR rates are ridiculous.
Yeah.
So I don't know your
Yeah.
personal practice. I'll share mine. I've shifted to your point, mostly use my credit card so I can get the point. But my practice is to pay off my credit card in full because I feel like if I
Yeah.
don't, then I'm paying more for the things. That's my
Yeah.
logic. Like I'm paying more for the things on the back end.
Different, like in personal versus business, right?
Oh,
Because in
absolutely. Yeah.
business, there may be an opportunity cost. In business, you might be able to get a term loan that's 14% that you pay off over 18 months, but your credit card might be 17% on the year. But if you pay it off in 3 months, you're not paying that full 17%, so you really got to look at which one works for what it is that you're attempting to do.
That's helpful. Maybe a little more context on that because I've not necessarily paid attention to the differences in APRs, annual percentage rates around interest rates for business credit cards versus personal
Mhm.
credit card. So are
Mm.
those terms typically different?
No. I'm not saying that the terms are necessarily significantly different. I don't think that's the case. In some instances, I can't remember what it is, but there's a credit union that's specifically for the United Nations credit union or something, but anybody can get into it if you're a member. And
Okay.
they have a credit card with the rate of like 11%. I don't own that credit card, by the way, but in the space of credit, that's unheard of.
I was just
As
that's
an
very
APR,
low for a credit
because,
card.
anywhere from 17, 18 to like
24.
25, 29. But it really, again, it depends on what you're trying to do. So even if you have a credit card that's at a 29% and you're spending at the beginning of at that month on a big purchase, and let's say you don't pay it off by the end of the month, but maybe you pay off half of it, right? You pay the rest off that following month, as long as it's not a charge card like an Amex. You pay the rest off, then the next month, you would still be under what you would likely get for a term loan, at least for the business that I'm in,
Mhm.
which term loans are short-term loans that sometimes they're collateralized, sometimes they're not, but usually they have a flat rate. I just got offered one today. It was a flat rate of 8% over the duration of a year, which you're going to pay that 8%. It really don't matter if you pay it early or if you pay it late. You're going to pay that 8%. Whereas with
Right.
your
No matter
credit
what.
card, if you have the 20 some odd percent, that's annual. So you're not paying
There.
20 something percent every month. You're paying that, in layman's math divided by 12, right?
Right.
And so it compiles. So you might
Mm-hmm.
ultimately pay more than that if you
Hold it
hold on
longer
to
than
it.
a year. Yeah.
Yeah, if you hold it
Yeah.
longer than a year. But essentially that's what it boils down to. So I use them differently. And sometimes it could be a balancing game. It's contingent upon how much capital we need at the time for a project.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's helpful. And yes, you brought up a great point around the compound interest. And to your point, that is an annual rate. So it is going to be broken down based off of the month. And so to your point, as long as you're paying it off under a certain time frame and time period, you may end up paying less interest. But
But if you
that's
can pay it off every month, just pay it off pay it off every
no, but I
month and
mean,
don't pay any interest. Yeah. Yeah.
oh, but again, to the same point, if you need to float that cash, that's an important thing to note. And then, yeah, not keeping too much money in the banks. Now, I don't know what your personal threshold is for that. I mean, I am probably more Zennial, so I feel like I do still need to be able to feel like there's at least a certain threshold of cash that I can just literally tomorrow, hurricane hits, boom,
I don't keep, when I tell you I keep nothing,
I need the
like
cash.
I don't have in my personal bank account, it might be $500 in my personal bank account. Doesn't mean like cash that I can access, which like it's way different from that, right?
Yeah,
But my personal account is whatever bill is coming up, that's how much money is because I really want it to be working. I want the money to be working.
yeah,
And I'll give you an example. Like QYLD is what we talked about on our previous call. That's
yes.
one of the securities that my money is in. That is a security that it's an ETF that has the covered call strategy, right?
Hmm.
That covered call strategy, and mind you, my mentor, who introduced me to this, he might be mad like you're saying this on a podcast. You're supposed to be, I don't know, but it's public. Anybody can buy it, and there's still the risk associated with it. But if you had, let's say, 100 grand and you had it in this security and you left it in it, each month you would roughly get an income about $1,000. If it also fluctuates and moves up, you're also gaining that as added value to the equity that you're holding. And so let's say I had a term loan that was percent, but I'm getting 1% a month on 100,000, then technically that money that would be in that term loan is best suited in that security, right? Now,
Right.
definitely would not recommend doing that. Don't get a loan to put it in a security. I know people do that all the time, but you can lose everything doing that. But if you
Mhm.
just think about it, there's a 2% different on that year. So if your money was in that account, what you would have been paying on it, you could literally pay it with the money that's in that account based on how much the cost of the loan is. There's different ways to finagle how you manage those things, but I think the basis of how you should use credit is what you mentioned. I use it, get the benefit, pay it off, use it for what you will be spending your cash on already, and then use that same cash to pay that credit card.
Yeah, I agree, especially for individual who are maybe starting out with even just the idea of delving into credit. And then as they advance, they can do more things like being thoughtful about where they need to use credit, where they could put their cash somewhere else versus even thinking about paying off that credit card immediately. What makes
Right.
sense when it comes to managing debt. And I think you even mentioned a shift around the way that you manage debt and credit, at least beyond personal credit, more so debt, like thinking about installment loans and how you shifted your mix there. I don't know if you want to mention that.
Yeah, I won't go into too much depth, but my thought process is I want to have a positive net worth.
Hmm.
So if my assets don't exceed my liabilities, I feel like I'm in a bad position. And so the way I operate is I won't take on any capital that exceeds the totality of my assets. So that at any given point, if I needed to liquidate assets or investments to pay off things or cover things, I still would be in a net positive. So let's say pay off my house, pay off my car, pay off loans and pay off credit cards. The idea would be at the end of that, you still would be in a net positive. And so that's how I operate. It's not always possible. I had a little bit of a nest egg when I left my job, and I've just been compiling on top of that.
Yeah.
And so my personal income primarily goes into investments. I don't really take that much off the brand, but that's really what it is for me. And then as those investments grow, that's really what ultimately would have been quote unquote my salary.
Got it. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And as we wrap the conversation, is there anything that I missed or anything that you wanted to mention?
I think right now there's such a plethora of information available for people who want to get into investing. And if you are going to get into investing in any type of way, any specific mechanism, I would say just focus on one thing first. Oftentimes will ask questions. Do you know about cryptocurrency? Do you know about bonds? Do you know about securities? Do you know about options? Do you know about trading currency? And I would say every single one of those things is a valid mechanism
Hmm.
for investment. It's just a matter of being knowledgeable about them. And it's very difficult to be extremely knowledgeable about all of them. And so even in securities, typically, I would also recommend really focusing in on like 2 to 3 securities and really knowing them in and out before managing your own investments. So you could really understand the ebbs and flows of those so that you're not acting erratically when something shifts in value.
Hmm. Great point. And to that, are there any particular tools, resources, books that you'd recommend for folks who are looking to get into investing? Any things that beyond your mentorship you found helpful in your journey?
So one thing that I will say, the men and women of the Senate and Congress, they have to share their investments publicly. And oftentimes, if you're looking for anticipated trends or movement in the market, you can go and look at theirs. I'm trying to remember the exact site. I can't remember it right now, but that's a way to be exploratory at least. Also, if you have Schwab, which was Ameritrade, Schwab just bought Ameritrade, then you can use TradeStation on there, and they have a portion of the application. I mean, not TradeStation, excuse me. I can't remember what it's called, but they have an application on there that was originally an Ameritrade application where you can trade with paper money, which is essentially fake money. So you can
Okay.
practice. And I would absolutely recommend. So if you're thinking of different strategies, you can use that tool as the market is open, or you could either run back and practice on specific market days to see how you might have done on that day. That's as far as investing is concerned. I would recommend that. And then the last thing, a lot of places have this, but Yahoo for the longest has had where you can put a fake portfolio and you can add shares in it. And then you could see what your money would have done if you would have lost it or if you would have gained it. I've been doing that for years. So I would recommend people to use that as well.
No, that's awesome. You're right. I forgot about that with Yahoo, but that's a great point and something that people can use. One thing that I want to add too, when folks are thinking about investing, once you do start to invest your real money, to your earlier point, David, is what you decide to invest, you need to invest what you're willing to lose. And 9 times out of 10, if you make a smart decision, you're not going to lose it over time because people tell you it's
Mm,
time in the market is what really matters and riding the waves over time. But you do need to be to put aside, like, don't invest your rent money. One of the cool things that exists now that certainly didn't exist when you and I were coming up is the barrier to entry for people to invest is lower because you have tools like your Robinhoods or other things that will allow folks to invest at lower denomination. I've spoken to some college students when I was doing my research project, and some of them had already started investing, and it's not like they needed to have thousands of dollars to invest because
yeah,
they're able to essentially buy micro shares of things and just get started. So it's really cool to be able to do that. But to the point, put aside something that you don't have to think about disposable
me.
income. But the idea that the disposable income needs to be a lot is not necessarily the case.
No, 100%. And that platform was called Thinkorswim, by the way.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Cool.
What's a quote or something that you live by that you want to leave our listeners with as
Mm,
we think about 2024, moving, from the dungeon forward? What's top of mind for you?
I would say victory over vanity. And essentially, what that means to me is do you want to actually win or do you want to look like you won?
Mm,
And do you want to actually be wealthy or do you want to look like you're wealthy? Do you want to actually be well read, or do you want to look like you read a bunch of books, right? You want to be fit, or you want to look,
I don't know when
yeah,
this episode is going to release, but we're talking on the heels of the Cat Williams, Shannon Sharp interview.
right.
So I'm keep thinking
Yeah.
about
Do you want to actually be funny, or,
Right.
but yeah, so victory over vanity for me is focusing on what's real, focusing on what is actually going to serve you in the long run. And I think people will be fine. People will be okay after that.
I know I said we were wrapping up, but you can touch on a really great point, especially in this day and age of social media. How do you stay grounded in focusing on victory over vanity? Like, how do you stay grounded in making sure that your priorities around building the brand, building wealth, all of that is in alignment there, right? And not get caught up
Uh-huh.
in the imagery of things, which is big in
Man.
our culture right now.
So there was, I think his name is Everett, the CEO of Kickstarter. I don't know if you got a browser open right there.
I can look.
But a young Black guy in his mid-30s, and he was recently awarded a Forbes award. I think it was Forbes 40 under 40 or Forbes Power List. I can't remember exactly what it was,
Mhm.
but he made a comment that was like, it's been difficult to accept those awards and the way that people look at you when you know that behind the scenes, you're not exactly where they're presenting you as, right? Like,
Mm.
and that is subjective because that's you being where you want to be. And so I've experienced that. I've experienced where I've gotten recognition. I'm like, man, if they only knew what happened yesterday, or that we just got a whole shipment of things that we paid for them are all errored that we now have to figure out a way to liquidate or whatever, right? Whatever might
Mhm.
actually be going on at the time. I think those types of things, they ground you because it's like, yes, you can bask in the glory of this thing, right? Of this, whatever the accolade might be.
Mhm.
But at the end of the day, you still got to go home to the work. You still got to
Right.
go home to whatever it is that you were hoping to make progress on. And the hope is that perhaps that brings exposure to it. And so I stay grounded in what I look at as success, right? I stay grounded in understanding the energy of my brand or people engaging with it. So I feel like the engagement is down. Have we lost our connection with our audience? And those are the things I'm focused on. And then also those connect directly to sales. And then I'll pay attention to my own energy. Like, how excited am I about approaching this project? That usually can tell me whether or not I'm doing something that's shifting me in the wrong direction. 9 times out of 10, it'll be something that's a money play over a authentic focus on brand.
Mm.
And those are always crazy. It would seem like they're good decisions. It's almost always a bad decision because it steers the ship off track from all of the work that you did to build the audience that you already had. When you take
Mhm.
on that type of project, the people that were with you, they then depart. And
Right.
so it's learning that doing that causes that type of interaction. And so you actually benefit from being authentic. I just recently read 2 different books that have the same messaging. One is called The Creative Act by Rick Rubin, and the other one is called The War of Art. And I can't remember the author. I think it's Steven something. But both of those talk about resistance in the creative process, and resistance being you have this idea, but for whatever reason, you don't ever try to bring that idea to fruition. And it's really because of resistance. So in the War of Art, it talks about using resistance as a tool. So when you get to that thing that feels like you get that little bit of anxiety about doing it, you can use that tool to tell you, this is the thing that I need to do. This is the discomfort that I need to run towards. And then in the Creative Act by Rick Rubin, it talks about the idea of resistance, but it also talks about how when you have an idea, those ideas come from source, whatever your source may be, whatever you believe,
Mhm.
but it usually is that idea's time. So if it doesn't come from you, it's highly likely that if it's actually a good idea, it's going to end up manifesting itself somewhere else. and not by the nature of somebody copying you, because they might not even be in the realm of in your circle or in your ecosystem, but just by the nature of all of the things that needed to come together for that idea to manifest, being there and existing for multiple people that are connected to source. And so I think those two things have re-energized me
Mhm.
to really focus on creativity and keeping myself sharp. And so while Dungeon Forward is my baby, I've also begun to explore external projects. And I recently got a sample for one of the projects that is on my desk, actually, from a company I formed called Fun Projects. The company is literally called Fun Projects because it's the things that give me joy to do. And so this one is a game. It's called Yearionaire.
Okay.
It's a culture trivia game based on knowing when things happened. And so I'll show you like an example card.
Okay.
You'll see, I don't know. Well, you can't read it because it's backwards, but this one is about crisscross.
I saw.
And when they launched the single jump, this one is like, if you can name the superhero when the movie happened,
Was
but
that
it's
Blank
Blank
Man?
Man, 1994. But yeah, so that's like, this is what it looks like. There's a currency that I invented for the game, or that we invented for the game, called a yillage, which is basically a year in currency. So in the game, you spend time. But that's like influencing my ability to also stay sharp in what I do within Dungeon 4 now.
Absolutely. That's
Yeah.
awesome. So you gave us
Mm.
some good resources for the financial piece, some great books that I will link in the show notes for our listeners. And just lastly, folks want to follow you, stay in touch, stay connected. Give us all your social handles.
Got you. If you want to follow me personally, it's I am Castro on Dungeon Forward and Twitter or X. And if you want to follow the brand, it's Dungeon Forward on everything. Any social media is Dungeon Forward.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, David. This is such a robust conversation, and I know that I was enlightened by it, and I hope that it
Oh,
will.
you are incredible. Hey, you keep me on task because I'll be veering off.
It's my job. My job. But no, thank you. Thank you for coming. And thank you so much for participating in this project. Have a great rest of your day.
You too. Keep being dope. Thank you.
Well, that's all for today, folks. Enjoyed the show? Be sure to like and rate the podcast. You can find the Race, Wealth, and Health podcast on multiple platforms, including Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Be sure to subscribe and turn on your notifications so you never miss an episode. I also want to hear from you, so don't forget to connect with me on social media. You can follow the podcast on Instagram and Facebook at Race, Wealth, Health. By joining the online community, you'll stay updated on the latest episodes, behind the scenes insights, and engaging discussions. Share your thoughts, comments, and questions there. I appreciate your support in sharing the podcast with your friends, family, and colleagues who may also find value in these conversations. Thank you again for joining me on this journey. Until next time, take care, stay informed, and keep up the good fight for equality.